So we don't have a lot of time, and I know we're right at the end of this convention, so I don't want to keep you longer, and I'm going to go through things rather quickly. Hopefully don't skip over anything that you really wanted to know. We're going to hopefully have time at the end for some questions, so you can get your questions at the end, but if I go over my 15 minutes, these two are going to be mad at me for cutting into their time. So I'm with the U.S. Department of Labor Wage and Hour Division, and our office enforces several different laws. The ones that we're going to talk about today that is of interest to you is the Fair Labor Standards Act. That's the law that generally provides for the payment of minimum wage, overtime. There's also some child labor provisions that I'm not going to talk about because I'm going to let my friend from the Texas Workforce Commission talk about that. And there's also some record-keeping rules. So the first thing that we look at when we look at the Fair Labor Standards Act is whether or not a business is covered. It is a federal law, so in order for the law to apply, we have to have jurisdiction to investigate a company or to even look at whether or not the law applies. And there's two ways that a company can fall under the jurisdiction of the Fair Labor Standards Act. The first is the entire enterprise can be covered. And in general, that's a business that makes at least $500,000 a year and has at least 2 full-time employees. The other way is for employees to be individually covered. And in restaurants, this is what we usually look at. A restaurant that makes less than $500,000 a year will look at employees and whether or not they're individually covered. If they are involved in interstate commerce in some way. The easiest way that we look and the way we normally look at restaurants is employees who are taking credit card payments. So just some very basics. Employees that are covered and are not otherwise exempt from the law have to be paid at least a minimum wage of $7.25 an hour. And we're going to talk a little bit about what we normally look at in restaurants and what causes, I think, the most trouble for both business owners like you and for our agency, and that's the tipped employees. Like I just said, the Fair Labor Standards Act requires that all employees be paid at least the minimum wage of $7.25 an hour. There are employees who are receiving tips as part of their wages, and those tips can count towards the $7.25. And there's a few requirements that you probably are all very familiar with that you have to follow in order to pay that tipped wage. The amount of cash wage that the employee has to be paid before the tips is $2.13 an hour. Any extra pay that employees get because of tips, an employer can claim that as a tip credit up to $5.12 an hour. What that means is that tipped employee is always considered to be paid minimum wage, even if their tips are $10 for the week, or $10 an hour for the week, and they got their $2.13 cash wage. What we recognize is that that employee was still only paid $7.25. They're still considered a minimum wage employee. And as we go through, I'll tell you a little bit why that's important. In order to claim that tip credit, all of the tips received by the employee have to be kept as the property of the employee, unless it's part of some kind of tip pooling arrangement. But when I say the tips are the property of the employee, that means that the employer can't use them for their purposes. Those tips can't be used to pay for a walkout. They can't be used to pay other employees. They can't be used to pay the management. Those are property of the employee. The final part of taking that tip credit is that employees have to know that they're subject to the tip credit and that they're being paid the cash wage and that part of their tips counts towards the minimum wage for their pay. Again, we told you that tips are the property of the employee. We thought it so important we put it on its own slide. Tips are always the property of the employee. They are never the property of the restaurant. Even if the restaurant is overseeing the tip pool arrangement and divvying the tips up among all of the employees, those tips are always the property of the employee. And this is why I said that minimum wage portion of the tip arrangement is important. Tipped employees are minimum wage employees, even if it is a big fancy restaurant where we all know their tips far exceed $7.25 an hour. That employee is still considered to be a minimum wage employee. As an employer, a restaurant is only allowed to take credit up to the minimum wage. So we also look at deductions from pay. Any deductions made from a tipped employee's wages is going to bring their wages below minimum wage. And when I say deductions, I'm not talking about statutory deductions. I'm talking about things like uniforms, cash register shortages, walked out checks, that sort of thing. Any deductions for those items from a tipped employee is going to be a minimum wage problem. So when we look at the Fair Labor Standards Act and the payment of minimum wage and the payment of overtime, we have to look at what are considered hours of work. What we look at is any time that is suffered or permitted by an employer. What that means, any time that an employee is working to the employer's benefit, whether it has been asked of them or not, that's work time. If you have an employee that decides they want to stay over late to clean their section a little better, you never asked them to do it, maybe you didn't even want them to do it, they did it anyway, that's time worked, it's time that has to be paid. Anytime an employee spends waiting to work, restaurant gets a little bit slow, the cooks or the wait staff have some downtime, they sit, they have to stay in the restaurant, they're just waiting for customers to come in, not really much to do, but they have to be there in case a customer comes in. They're waiting. That waiting is a benefit to the employer, it's time that has to be paid. Certain meal and rest breaks need to be paid, not all. A meal break that's generally like 30 minutes for a lunch doesn't have to be paid. A short 15-minute Coke break, smoke break, something like that, that time still has to be paid. And then, of course, any time spent training that directly is going to benefit the employee in their job, that's directed by their employer, done during work hours, that all has to be paid. Any time spent traveling as part of the job. Maybe we've got a restaurant that has 2 or 3 locations. The cook works one location in the morning and a location across town is short-staffed, so you send a cook over to the other location. The time spent traveling from one restaurant to the other, that's actually work time. Okay. So the last thing I'm going to talk to you a little bit about is overtime. Everybody pretty well knows what overtime is. Employees have to be paid time and a half for any hours they work over 40 in a work week. That work week is determined on a regular basis. It can be a calendar week. It can be really any week that an employer determines. It's just 7 consecutive days. Whoops. And I'm going to talk just a little bit, I'm sorry, I've got a slide I think that's missing, about the overtime payments for different employees. There are employees that are entitled to overtime. Maybe they're not paid hourly. Maybe you've got cooks that are paid on a salary basis. If we're talking about cooks that are not supervisory employees, not somebody that is a professionally trained chef who is creating their own menus and that sort of thing, just your regular line cook, maybe paid a salary, still entitled to overtime pay when they work over 40 hours. Probably one of the biggest problems we find in restaurants, cooks that are just paid a salary working 50 or 60 hours a week with no overtime. Oops. Like I said, there are some exceptions to that rule. There are employees that are exempt. Typically what we see are what we consider the white-collar exemptions. We'll have executive employees, certain administrative employees, some professional employees. The minimum salary for those employees is $455 a week. And that's a guaranteed salary, not just what they get paid with their hourly rate plus commissions. It's guaranteed. They know every week they're going to make a minimum of $455 a week. That salary is never reduced. They can count on that salary every week. They're even going to get paid if they miss a half a day of work. The main exemption that we find that's applicable in restaurants is the executive exemption. That's for employees who are supervising. And supervising means that they have the authority to hire, fire. They have the authority maybe to set pay rates. They do some training. They schedule employees for work. And it's not just that, okay, we're going to say that this guy's the manager and he's going to do all of the hiring. There's also, there may be other people that maybe have suggestions into the hiring. Their decisions are given some weight. You may not go with their final decision, but you're taking into account their opinions when you hire somebody or fire somebody. There are other exemptions. I'm skipping that because just for the interest of time, I just wanted to talk to you about the most common one for your industry. If you have others that you think might apply, call one of our local offices. We'll be happy to talk to you about it. So the final thing I wanted to talk to you about before I turn it over is records that are required to be kept. There are certain records that need to be kept and maintained. And essentially, it's records of the hours that employees are working. It's record of the pay that they're getting. There's no rule that you have to have a particular time clock, nothing that says employees have to clock in on the cash register, just some kind of record of time. It can be handwritten, it can be very informal, but there has to be a record that shows what hours employees are working. There is also some required posting. Our office has posters for the Fair Labor Standards Act as well as the other laws that we enforce. I will just give my general public service announcement. If you call our office, those posters are free. Anybody can get those. We don't charge for them, so there's never a reason to not have the required posters. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to turn it over now. I told you that part of what the Fair Labor Standards Act requires a certain child labor rules, certain jobs that minors can and can't do, certain age restrictions. The federal law is very similar to what we have in the state of Texas. There are some differences. So I'm going to turn it over to Efrain, and he is going to talk to you a little bit about child labor rules, specifically from the state side, but it is very similar to what we enforce.
Good afternoon. Does everyone have this handout? I'm just going to discuss this one right here. And all we do is the child labor laws. Texas Workforce Commission also investigates unpaid wages and child labor laws. So those are the two main departments within our labor law office. We reflect a lot of the federal laws. We are different in some respects. For example, the coverage. We have coverage over all employers, small and large. We don't have to do an interstate commerce test. So we'll just want to make sure that if the employer is conducting business in Texas, the Texas Workforce Commission has that jurisdiction to investigate. So on the child labor laws, if you would all open up your handouts, the minimum age for work is 14. 14 and 15-year-olds have work hour restrictions. When we investigate, we want to make sure that, of course, that they are at least 14 because they can work at age 14. We want to also see the exemptions. The most common exemption is when a child works for his parent. As long, in our law, the Texas Labor Code 51, as long as they are working for their parent, they are being supervised, and the work is non-hazardous. There's no dangerous machinery, something that could be hazardous for that minor. Direct supervision, and that the business has to be owned by that parent or the general manager. The main operational manager, we will take that into consideration. But those three criteria have to be met in order for that child who is younger than 14 to work at that parent's restaurant or business. All right. So we want to look at where I see most of the violations. So I looked at the past couple of years, we see most of the violations in child labor laws when it comes to the work hours. There are two different laws. There's the federal law from the U.S. Department of Labor, and then there's the Texas law. The Texas law is a little bit more lenient. We are going to enforce the work hours. And basically on ours, on the right-hand side of your handout, the bottom part of it will have the differences between state and federal. So state law says not past 10 o'clock on a school night. That's when they cannot work, past 10. And in the school year, the federal law will have 7 o'clock. Okay? So there are two different ones. Which one do you follow? When we go in and inspect, we just tell you that you most probably will qualify or fall under the federal law, but we can only enforce the state law. So if somebody from DOL, Department of Labor, were to come in, they're going to enforce the 7 o'clock rule for that 14 and 15-year-old. Once a child is 16, they can work any hours. 16 and 17, there's no state or federal law on the work hours. Okay? So a lot of companies feel safer at higher than age 16 because they don't have to worry about the work hours. If there is someone who's 14 and 15, the review would be from their records, their time in and time out records. So we will request to see those. 14 and 15-year-olds, as a general rule, really simple, even if you lose this piece of paper, nothing power-driven. Anything that connects to electricity, the mixers, the slicers, all those are power-driven machines. Even a lawnmower is power-driven, those are prohibited because it's power-driven. We do allow the permits office machines for 14 and 15-year-olds. So 14 and 15-year-olds, nothing power-driven. Cooking, baking are generally prohibited. Cooking, especially if it's open flame like the gas stove, and baking, and all processes that lead to baking, not just necessarily the oven, but the prep work that they do before the oven, that is prohibited for 14 and 15-year-olds. On the right-hand side of the poster, it'll have a nice outline as to all the jobs that are prohibited for 14 and 15-year-olds. It'll talk about categories like loading and unloading, your power-driven equipment, just any environments, the construction environments, all that would be on your right-hand side. They have extra prohibited occupations. On the left, there's a nice outline. There's 17 hazardous orders, and those apply to all minors. But when we look at the 16-year-old, we're just going to look at the left-hand side of the poster. Okay, so here's where I see most of the violations on the left-hand side of the poster. Number 2, you'll look at that, it's the driving. Because the minor has a driver's license at age 16 does not mean that they can do the delivery or the errands for the business. So no driving for age 16. 17-year-olds can drive under limited circumstances, and I also gave you an insert for that. So they can drive under limited circumstances. But be very careful, because this is where we see most of the violations, is thinking that they have a license. Go ahead and send them to the bank or send them to the store to pick up supplies. So make sure to be on the safe side, 18, but if you're going to send them at 17, make sure you meet all the requirements that are in your handout. This one right here, okay? The other prohibited occupation for all minors that I see in restaurants are your meat slicers, which is hazardous order 10, and your dough mixers. When you are, for example, the dough mixers, even just helping load the mixers, they're not operating it, they're not touching the button, but they're helping to assist. That is one of the prohibited occupations for minors. So they're helping the cook to pour the water, the yeast, the flour, those are prohibited occupations. The slicers, The miner may not be operating the slicer, but the cook took the slicer apart. They took all the parts to the slicer. They put them in the sink, and the miner now washes these parts. Under the law, this is an amendment that minors under age 18 are prohibited from washing the parts, sharp or unsharp. So that's really important on the slicers or any meat processing machines. One of the crazy things that I've seen was that we're applying to restaurants is roofing. Even though it's not a construction company, but they're going to the roof to hang signs or banners. And as you see, maybe at some Chick-fil-A's, they put the inflatable display, the cow. Those are roofing operations, so just keep that in mind as well. I gave you my contact information with my email. It's on this handout. We'll be glad to help you. We do have a representative here in San Antonio. I'm filling in for him, but I'm in Austin, so I'll be glad to help with any questions that you may have.
Hello. Oh, hi. Okie doke. Well, the way it goes is I end up with all the bad stuff that happens at y'all's jobs. And so I'm sort of the preventative maintenance of the Department of Insurance. I do workplace safety. And I've done plenty of research on the things that y'all are encountering while on the job. And let's face it, it all has to begin somewhere, even if we're sort of starting halfway through. And the way we need to start is by accident prevention programs. The main thing is that whenever management doesn't believe in anything that's written down that other people are supposed to follow, it's not really going to go anywhere. And we sort of have to get creative. And the best part about this whole thing is, you know, your insurance company is actually supposed to be providing help for you for free. So if y'all need like some type of, you know, pick me up in order to get stuff done, give them a call. But that's the most important thing that we need to begin with is this active management situation going on. And pretty much, it's very important also that whenever we have management that they actually comprehend and understand and are actually passionate about things. The sad part is that I really am passionate about these things because whenever people go in for trials trying to get workers' comp, I see the end result of some people not having gone to the doctor at all, and they end up sort of sideways. And that's harsh to look at, and especially whenever they have to have their family help them out along the way. So we have to actually have these goals, and then even then, have management do a little bit of research of what those bad things like climbing up a ladder and being a young kid and not having, you know, enough stability. Heck, I have a 19-year-old son who's basically like Gumby because he's barely growing into his own body. So these things are the things that are actually required training because in the state of Texas, falls are the leading cause of death within the state. So it is very important that basically, yeah, we have to help everybody through sort of everything, and especially since, well, let's face it, if you have a claim of a broken arm, it's a compensation cost of around $108,000. So that's pretty harsh, and then whenever you have just a claim, that'll increase, well, your rate for your insurance if you have it, you know? But most definitely, I'm all about y'all actually do know the solutions to your own problems yourselves. I just am the facilitator of figuring it out and helping you put it on paper and getting it through there. But the main thing is that I do believe in numbers. And, well, it turns out that we have actually increased in injuries and illnesses within your industry from 2015 to 2016. And that's just life. And I guess we need to sort of have more idea of how to prevent things like that happening. And if you ask me, it sort of goes with the economy, like the ups and downs of it. More people are in the restaurant industry because they've gotten out of the oil field, and it all depends on whatever is going on. But the main thing is that we've made a significant jump from 15 to 16. But I have done a little bit more research, and it turns out 16 to 19-year-olds are your problems. I don't know what it is. Well, actually, we do. They're kids. They're basically kids. Their frontal lobes haven't really developed yet, so their reasoning is actually not all there. And that's another reason why, for males, 25, that's supposedly the age that we get our frontal lobes for the gentleman set up and good to go. But we have a pretty big 490 for 2016. And yeah, slips, trips, and falls. I can only imagine that it's because they're in a hurry and life is going on or whatever else. I've even found that a few people in the state of Texas in 2016 even put their foot in a fryer. Odd. But it happened. The thing is that I really want to put into perspective for y'all is that, 16 to 19 are your problem because total, there was 1,380 reported injuries and illnesses for 16 to 19-year-olds in 2017. This is just the latest stuff. And your industry takes up more than a third of the pie. And it's just because you have more of those that age range in particular, working for y'all. And the best part is that kids, they just want to be talked to and listened to. Just, that whole golden rule of treating each other the way we would want to be treated. And sometimes, honestly, whenever they're having a bad time, it's just because, they're dealing with life and then life creeped into work and vice versa. So as management, whenever we actually speak to these kids, we have to sit down and listen. And then sometimes they're just very standoffish and don't want to talk at all because who knows what. But the main thing is there, as an industry, the people who are exposing them to more stuff, we really need to have management pull back on the reins because at that age, they tend to want to prove themselves more than anybody else. And it makes a better idea for management to at least come up with some sort of solution on how to speak to the person so that they don't jump ahead of the game and then end up in a spot that they don't want to be, and then it's $108,000 worth of workers' comp for a broken arm. And that's just for a broken arm. And the main thing is also, pretty much, I get to answer the safety violations hotline for the state of Texas. So anybody can call in and, let us know what they got, going on at work that they feel is hazardous. Workplace violence is huge. Plates thrown everywhere, fist fights, lots of stuff. It really is impacting y'all's industry. Maybe it's because everybody has low blood sugar and needs more food. Who knows, But the main thing is that those are the things that we're having a big problem with within your industry and that we're actually having to deal with. Now, it is the law. We are supposed to provide our employees with a safe and healthful workplace. The threat of violence from somebody else is not a safe and healthful workplace. So that's when administrative functions have to take over to where maybe you schedule people at different hours or whatever it may be. But that has to be taken care of because OSHA does consider that to be a violation of the law. But yeah, slip, trips, and falls. For anybody above the ages of 16 to 19, it's broken pelvises from slipping, tripping, and falling. And an arm is $108,000, right? Could you imagine the cost of a pelvis? So these are the things that we really need to consider whenever we are having people do anything. I mean, heck, some people trip over their own feet because they're not wearing the appropriate size shoes. So those are the things we really need to take, account for. Also, let's see if it'll work. The people behind me weren't lying. Driving is a big problem. Since we're here for work, we are more likely, statistically, to get in a wreck. And we're at work. So it counts towards a problem with our job scope that we will run into that would result in OSHA getting super duper upset with, just simply because we're supposed to be giving our employees a safe and healthful workplace. It involved travel. But most definitely, please be on the lookout for that. And also, pretty much, the state of Texas really is trying to prevent all this stuff from happening. Help you in any single way that we possibly can, because, well, there are way too many lawyers in my building, and we'd rather have us as the preventative maintenance be more. You know what I mean? It's definitely keeps y'all's workers' comp costs low. So, I mean, if y'all have any questions, y'all can look at tdi.texas.gov and just Google it, or you can call me directly. And if I don't know the answer, I'll find somebody who does. And also, seriously, teach 16 to 19-year-olds to take their time. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions for our panel here today? Any questions? Oh, on the back row. Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Contreras, when you discuss the 14 to 17-year-olds and their prohibitions, does that also include children of owners and operators, or do they follow the same limitations?
We'll have to establish, first of all, an employment relationship. So if there is an employment relationship, then we can enforce the Texas Labor Code or the Fair Labor Standards Act, which enforces the child labor law. So first of all, if that owner-operator he's the owner, there's nobody above him, there's no jurisdiction for us. It's a good question. Thank you. Because a lot of kids take their own lawnmowers and go and...
Hi, so this question is about, in general in our industry, there's a lot of like stagiaires that always try and come in to work and learn whether they're auditioning for a job or not. And that's different in Europe than it is in the States and I think Texas specifically. So how does that qualify? How are we supposed to say yes or no to somebody that is looking to just learn or apprentice or auditioning for a job, or even somebody that works for us that wants to come in early to learn a new skill?
For an apprentice, are they in a program through their school or?
I mean, for us, we have people that want to come work. For us, we have people who want to come work with us, like from another country or even from another restaurant that wants to come and learn a skill set. So they, will not get hired on, but they're asking to come learn a skill from us.
And are these under age 18?
No, they're not.
They're okay. That's fine. For the child labor laws is just for under age 18, so they should be okay.
Yeah, let me talk to it for just a bit because I don't want you to get in trouble now. So we're going to look at that employment relationship thing that you're gaining from having that person there. If they're actually, I'm assuming that you're a restaurant, if they're actually preparing the meals that your customers are consuming, you still are going to be obligated to pay them, even though they're learning at the same time that they're doing the work. If they're doing work for you, they're still going to be required to be paid at least the minimum wage.
So we basically will have to say no to anybody coming in that just like is from someplace else that slows us down.
Yeah, if they're coming in, if they're doing any kind of work at all, even if it's, slower than what your standard is, if they are performing any kind of productive work, you're going to have to pay them or just not take them on.
Other questions? Well, let's give our panel a hand. Thank you so much for being here, Efrain, Mary, and Erica. We appreciate it so much. And just as a shameless plug, WorkSafe Texas is a great workplace